Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I'm excited to be up here again this morning as we continue our journey through the Sermon on the Mount. Now, some of you know that I work in insurance, and what I do is, my title is a customer service agent. And I do a lot of just processing renewals and changes that we make sure they were done correctly, and then I mail them out. But the biggest part of my job is being a customer service agent. I receive phone calls and I help answer questions about their auto policy, workers' comp, property liability, really exciting things. And then I make changes and I send it out to make sure that they are covered. Now, for me to make changes to an insurance policy, I have to be licensed, have to, follow the law. And so at the end of last year, I took an 8-week online course, studied, got tested over federal laws and also state laws, and by the grace of God, I was able to pass it on my first try. But I don't know if you have like a homeowner's insurance policy or your auto policy. I don't know if you've ever been bored enough to be like, hey, I've got some free time, let me read this. It's very complicated. It is very legalese. It's got a lot of definitions, and this is how the coverages apply, and then there's exclusions, and it's just, even for me as someone who has passed it and I'm licensed, it is still really hard to understand. I've only been in this world for 10 months, and there's still a lot of learning and a lot of continuing of education to learn. And so in my job, it's really important that I can communicate insurance coverages properly. Otherwise, I could confuse or give some bad advice to our customers, or then it can fall back on me. So it's up to me to continue to learn. To go to my coworkers who, we have a point person. If you have an auto question, you go to so-and-so. Workers' comp, go to this person. So it's up to me to kind of humble myself to go and ask questions, to continue to learn, to make sure I learn these things correctly. And sometimes I have to go to our insurance carrier and be like, hey, our customer asked this question. Are they covered? Are they not covered? Help me understand this better. And they'll let me know. But sometimes it's hard to ask questions. Sometimes it's hard to seek help. And then sometimes I have to communicate that advice clearly to the customer. Sometimes it's good news, but sometimes it's not so good news. It's like, well, the insurance company needs to know all these questions, they need to see pictures, and then they'll determine whether or not they'll cover that certain situation. And so it's not always easy. And so, how about you? Are you continuing to learn in different areas in your life? Maybe at your job. Are there things where you need to seek advice and help, ask good questions? Maybe you've got professional development days or classes or conferences you can go to continue to learn and dig deeper. Even outside of work, are there hobbies you have that you like to learn more about? How are you learning? How are you growing in those areas? Is it by reading books, finding things online, podcasts? Or for me, the most beneficial way is to ask somebody and be like, hey, I've got this project I'm working on. Can you show me how to do it? Or I'm trying to grow a garden, but there's weeds and things. How can I make this, be fruitful? But it's always hard to step out of our box and do those things. And so, as we look at Matthew 7 today, we've been going through the Sermon on the Mount, and we're getting towards the end where Jesus is beginning to wrap things up. I just want to kind of highlight some of the things Jesus has talked about in the last couple chapters. Matthew chapter 5 starts out with the Beatitudes, where he presents the kingdom of heaven and what it looks like in this beautiful poem. And he calls us to be salt and light in the world. And he talks about how he has come to fulfill the law and the prophets. So all of these kingdom attributes are rooted in the Old Testament, that Jesus isn't coming up with some new idea. And he talks about how we shouldn't murder, but not even murder have an angry thought. How we shouldn't commit adultery, but not even that we shouldn't have a lustful thought. And he talks about divorce and swearing oaths and how we should love our enemies. And then some spiritual practices we should have, like giving to the needy, praying and fasting and building up treasures in heaven, and all these things as we read through. It's this is a lot. This is a really heavy things, and how are we able to do this on our own? Well, spoiler alert, we can't do it on our own, guys. We can't. And this is where Jesus, as he's wrapping up, explains how we can do this and what it looks like to live out the kingdom of God. So Matthew 7, verse 7. So the first point is rely on God. Maybe it was up there for a second, or there it is now. I'm good at knowing my sermon layout. So first point is rely on God. So 7:7 says, ask, and it will be given to you. Knock, seek, and you will find it. Knock, and the door will be open to you. So in this first verse, the big point is these three verbs: ask, seek, and knock. And in the Greek, these are imperatives, which means these are commands. Like these are something you should be doing. And it's not something we do one time, but it's this continual asking, seeking, knocking throughout our lives. It's these action verbs we should be doing. And so then the question is, what are we asking? What are we seeking? What are we knocking on? Well, for ask, if we look through the Sermon on the Mount, we see Jesus has been talking about prayer. So we need to be praying to God. We need to be asking him for like his will to be done. We need his knowledge, and we need to reflect it, and we need to seek our provision from him and forgiveness and overcoming temptation. These are things we should be praying and asking and seeking from God. And then seek. In 6:33, Jesus said, but seek first the kingdom and his righteousness, and these things will be added to you as well. So we see we should be seeking the kingdom of heaven, seeking his righteousness. And it says, and you will find it. There's a resolution there. And then thirdly, knock. What are we knocking on? And he doesn't actually use the word knock anywhere else in the Sermon on the Mount. So we're kind of left like, all right, like how do we picture this? Like what are we seeing in our minds? Well, it's like knocking. There's a door. That means we can't open it. So we're knocking on this door that we want open. And so maybe it's a barrier in our lives. Maybe it's something that we're struggling. We need God's help to open that door. When I think of knocking on the door, on a door, I get like tension within myself. Like this awkwardness, because like if you think back to when you've had to knock on somebody's door, somebody's house that you've never been to today, you have the address, you walk up, you look at the address, you got the number, you're like, all right, street house, this number matches that house, this should be so-and-so's house, like I should be good. Then you walk up to the door, and then you're met with that decision if they have a screen door. It's like, do you knock on the screen door, or do you open it up and knock on their actual door? And it's like, is that kind of being like awkward? Like, we have to make these decisions. And then finally, like, you knock, and then you're like, was that loud enough? Did they hear it? Or was that too loud? I don't want to be too aggressive. Like, you wait like what seems like an eternity, and then you're like, do I need to knock again? They're not answering their door. All these things go through my mind when I think of knocking on a door. Am I alone in that? Is there people? Okay, good. I'm glad I'm not alone. But so I think there's this vulnerability. Like we're putting ourselves out there. We're like, hey, I'm here. I want to talk to you. Like I want to come in your house and discuss things maybe. So like there's this vulnerability. And I think like when we're asking and we're seeking God and we're knocking on doors, it's like this stepping out in faith, like trusting him. And what's great is then we go to verse 8. And Jesus like reiterates these points, and like the focus is on like what will happen. So like for everyone who asks will receive. For everyone who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks the door will be open. We have these great promises that God's going to meet us, that we're not going to do these things in vain and maybe something will happen. He's like, no, you'll find it. You will receive it. The door will be open. We have these awesome promises, and we have confidence in God and these promises. But it all starts with us. We have to kind of initiate. It's not something where we can sit back and we'll find it. No, it's like, no, we have to go out and do these things. In our culture today, sometimes asking for help isn't really seen as a positive. I think things are changing. It's becoming more like not socially taboo, but encouraged. But there's still like this hesitancy sometimes with asking for help. I think throughout the pandemic, we've seen the importance of being in relationships with other people and how important it is to not be isolated. And so I think we need to be willing to ask for help, no matter what the circumstances. And that takes a lot of humility on our parts and a lot of being vulnerable, being like, hey, I am insufficient in this area. Like, I need somebody to help me, be it a friend, a family member. But sometimes we need to seek a professional, and there's no shame in that. Like, there shouldn't be this stigma with, oh, you go to counseling? It's like, no, like, way to go. like, way to seek help, way to better yourself. Like, we should celebrate that. And like so much more, like with God in our spiritual walk, like, are we seeking help? Are we asking God for help? And sometimes it can be really easy. We think about like, oh God, give me more patience, give me grace. Like, Lord, I need your strength. Lord, help me through such and such situation. But I think sometimes we really get afraid to ask God for like the real specific prayer requests or the real changes in our lives that need to happen, but like maybe we're not ready to let go of yet. Like maybe there's a specific sin issue that you're just kind of like, well, it really only affects me, and like I'll get around to it eventually, but like I'm not going to ask God. I'm not quite ready to let go of that yet. Or maybe we're holding this grudge against somebody else and we're withholding forgiveness. It's like, I don't want to ask God for that prayer request to help me forgive so-and-so. It's like somehow like we like to relish in that, but it's like, no, like we really should be bold in asking God for help in every area of our life. And so I think it's important when we pray or when we're asking God that we try to be specific. Like we don't leave things too general. It's like, all right, you're struggling at work. Like what's the problem at work? Like, what's going on? Is it a specific relationship? Is it something to do with your tasks? But ask God for like a specific prayer request. Like, Lord, like I'm struggling at work because of my relationship with so-and-so. It's like, help me have grace or compassion or understanding with them. Like, help me find reconciliation in that relationship. Or maybe there's a specific sin you're struggling with. Try to be specific. Like, Lord, I'm struggling with my anger. Lord, I'm struggling with gossip in this situation. Lord, I'm struggling with pornography. Like, Lord, I'm struggling with whatever. Name it and be specific and really seek God for his strength and wisdom to overcome these things. But that takes boldness to be specific. So we need to rely on God to live out all these things that Jesus has been teaching about in the Sermon on the Mount. And then the second thing we see, we need to trust God. Because it's one thing to seek him and to hear from him, but then do we trust him? Are we able to put it into practice? Let me explain. So verse 9, which of you, if your son asks for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a snake? If you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? So, Jesus is making it clear that we're evil. And he's kind of comparing us to God. It's like we look at how good and pure and holy God is, and we look at ourselves, there's no comparison. How can we say we're good if we're being compared to a holy, eternal, perfect God? Like, it's just, compared to God, we're evil, we're sinful. But yet, in our sinfulness, in our humanity, we still know how to give a good gift. And what is a good gift? I think in this passage, Jesus isn't talking about, like extra things. I know we're celebrating Father's Day, so I'm not saying giving gifts is wrong or sinful. It's just this isn't what Jesus is talking about here. Jesus is talking about kind of like your daily needs of a good gift. Like your son is hungry. Like you're not going to give him a stone. That's not going to satisfy him. That's not going to really nourish him. Like you're going to give him some bread. I was like, if he asked for fish, which would have been the very common food that they would have eaten probably every day and at most meals, it's like you're not going to give him a dead snake. It's like you're just not going to do that. That's just cruel. And think about my son. Like when he's hungry, I know what he likes. And right now we're really stuck on like mac and cheese and chicken nuggets, and that's okay. But as a good parent, I continue to challenge him to try other foods, to expand his palate. Because if I'm not challenging him in what he's eating, he's going to get stuck, and maybe he's not really going to get all of his nutrients that he really needs. And I think God does that to us as well. Yes, he's going to give us what he needs, but sometimes what we need is to be challenged to grow in other ways and in other areas. When my wife and I got engaged, we were living in Chicago. I was living in an apartment with a couple of other guys, and one day around my birthday, a large box shows up, and it's from my in-laws. I'm like, I'm assuming this is a gift. And so I open it up, and it's a box of power tools. Fun fact about me, I am not a handy person. I open this, I'm like, power tools, like, what am I gonna do with this? Like, I'm afraid to use like a saw, like I don't wanna cut off my arm or something. Like, I just have zero confidence. But yet my in-laws and their graciousness and their lovingness bought me power tools. And I'm like, I'm in an apartment, I don't have a lot of projects, I don't have things I'm working on, I never need a power tool to tighten anything. Like I have a landlord, like they come and take care of that stuff for me. Like there's just no need. But they have greater insight. They've been married longer. And so in the last 6 years, there have been more and more opportunities for me to use these power tools. They've come in very handy, especially when I bought a house. There's more things to work on and tinker with. And we want to make a water table out of PVC pipes for our son. It's like, oh, this is great. I've got a saw. I can do this and not hurt myself. And that's come from, again, my first point, asking for help. Like, hey, how do I do this safely? And so they've been coming handy. And so they have this insight of, you're getting married, you're eventually going to have a house someday. It's like these power tools are going to come in handy. And just in that moment, I didn't understand that. But through patience and waiting and time, it made more sense. So with God, the same thing is true. It's like God has given us gifts. He has given us talents. He has given us certain circumstances in our life. And so, are these good gifts? I think I've got it, yeah. And so, are we satisfied with them? With what he has given us? Yeah, it's going to challenge us. Yes, it might make us uncomfortable, but can we truly say we're satisfied with what God has given us? Like when we are praying and we're asking for help, and then he does something in our lives, we're like, okay, this is great. It's like maybe God is challenging us to grow in a certain way. Are we able to recognize that when those situations come up? It may not be easy. It might make us uncomfortable to learn a new skill or to overcome something, but we see elsewhere that God has a purpose for everything. Like God is going to use it for his good, and it's up to us to continue to walk through in obedience and faithfulness. So we rely on God, we trust God, and then Jesus kind of takes a curveball here, and then he throws in, we need to love other people. Verse 12 says, so in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you. For this sums up the law and the prophets. So Jesus is kind of wrapping everything up, because way back in chapter 5, he first referenced the law and the prophets. So here he's like, all right, the biggest takeaway is do unto others as you would have them do to yourself, or do unto us. And this phrase is not really unique to Christianity. A lot of other religions and just historical philosophies talk about this truth. And it's very important, but what does it really mean? Is it really I'm going to love you so that you'll love me back? No, that's a really selfish way of looking at it. It's we do it, throughout obedience, because this fulfills the law and the prophets. So we do it out of obedience to God. All right, this is how God is calling us to live, so we should do this. And then we also do it so that people can experience the goodness of God, and hopefully they will get to know God as well. And what's interesting is Jesus kind of reiterates this point in Matthew 22. This is 22:34 to 40. And he says, read this here. Hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with a question. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. And I found this passage so interesting. And the thing that stuck out to me as I was studying this was 39. Where it says, and the second is like it. The second commandment is just like the first one. So the first one is to love the Lord your God, and the second one is to love your neighbor. It's just like the first one. But in my mind, I'm how is loving the Lord just like loving your neighbor? He's but they're the same. It's they're very similar. If you love God, you're loving your neighbor, and if you love your neighbor, you're loving God. And for me, I was just like, wow. And in doing these things, the law and the prophets, hang on those two commands. So if you were to sum up the Old Testament, the command is to love God and to love your neighbor. It's like, that's it. It's like, that's it. That's the main thrust of it. It sounds so easy, but yet it's so hard. It is so hard sometimes to think outside of ourselves. So imagine a person. They love cooking. So they decide to go to culinary school. They learn all the great skills and techniques to make food delicious, and then after that they go and they study under one of the world's greatest chefs to continue to refine their technique and to just make beautiful, delicious food. But then after all that training, they decide to go back to their hometown, find a small mom and pop shop, and become a server. Would that make sense? Would we be like, what are you doing? It's like you spent all this time and effort and sacrificing to become a great chef that can make beautiful, delicious tasting food, and you want to be a server? It's like that doesn't make sense. We'd look at that and be like, you're in a way wasting your potential. It's like, that's great, you're still in the restaurant business, but you're serving, you should be back in the kitchen, what are you doing? You have this wonderful gift and this talent, but yet you're just wanting to serve. And I think for Christianity, sometimes we get caught up in that. We like to kind of not have pressure on us, maybe. It's great you're here on a Sunday morning. We need to gather together. We need to worship God in community, and we need to seek His Word and understanding and grow in our spiritual walk. And it's great that we have small groups and opportunities throughout the week to, again, gather together, to continue to focus on God and grow deeper there. It's like, that's great. We need those opportunities to grow, but then we need to use them. We need to apply what we're learning. We need to live it out. It's just like me with insurance. Yes, it's great that I passed that exam. It's great that I can go to my coworkers and learn and continue to get deeper understanding, but if I'm not applying it, if I'm not communicating to our customers this truth of insurance and what it means, I'm going to get fired. They're like, Steve, that's great, but we actually need you to do your job. Church, what's our job? Are we doing it? It's to love our neighbors as ourselves. It's great. Jesus talks about, asking Him for help. It's great about seeking His wisdom. It's great to be, trusting that He's going to give us these good gifts. But then what are we to use these gifts for? To love others, to build His kingdom. Matthew ends his gospel with a well-known passage called the Great Commission, where Jesus is sending out His disciples to all nations, and He tells them, this is 18, therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. And so yes, for Jesus' disciples to make disciples, they have to know Jesus' teaching. They have to know His commandments and have a good understanding, but then they have to go. They have to do it. And knowing that God is going to be with them. So when we are out there loving our neighbors, loving others as ourselves, we can have that same confidence that God is with us, that He has given us the strength and the knowledge and the wisdom to do it out. But it's up to us to do it. So church, 3 points again. Just we need to rely on God. We need to trust God. And then we need to live it out. We need to love others. It's not always easiest. It's not always the most comfortable thing to do. But it has eternal implications. It has a big impact, not just in our lives, but then in our neighbors, our friends, co-workers, strangers' lives. We don't know what God's going to do. We don't know the opportunities God is going to give us, but we rely on Him, we trust others, we trust God, and we love others.